2. Arrival of the Alma Alerons. By the time James had dressed and made his way down to the great hall for breakfast, it was nearly 10 o'clock. Less than a dozen students could be seen moving disconsolately among the detritus of the morning's earlier rush. At the far corner of the Slytherin table, Zane sat hunched and squinting under a beam of sunlight. Across from him was Ralph, who saw James enter and waved him over. As James made his way across the hall, 4 or 5 house elves, each wearing large linen napkins with the Hogwarts crest embroidered on them, circled the tables, meandering in what at first appeared to be random paths. Occasionally, one of them would duck beneath the surface of a table and then reappear a moment later, tossing a stray fork or half a biscuit casually onto the mess of the table. As James passed one of the elves, it straightened, raised its spindly arms, and then brought them swiftly down. The contents on the table in front of him swirled together as if caught in a miniature cyclone. With a great clattering of dishes and silverware, the corners of the tablecloth shot upwards and twisted around the pile of breakfast debris, creating a huge clanking bag floating improbably over the polished wood table. The house elf leaped from floor to bench to tabletop and then jumped, turning in midair and landing lightly on top of the bag. It grasped the twisted top of the bag, using the knot as if it were a set of reins, and turned the bag, driving it bobbingly toward the gigantic service doors in the side of the hall. James ducked as the bag swooped over his head. "Phew," Zane muttered as James plopped down next to him and reached for the last piece of toast. "These little waiters of yours may be weird-looking buggers, but they know how to make a good cup of coffee." "They're not waiters, they're house elves. I read about them yesterday," Ralph said, happily munching half a sausage. The other half was speared on the end of his fork, which he used like a pointer, indicating the elves. "They work downstairs. They're like the elves in that kid's story. The ones that came at night and did all the work for the cobbler." "The what?" Zane asked over his coffee mug. "The guy that makes shoes. He had all these shoes half finished and just lying around, and he was about to fall over from all the work. You know that story, don't you? So he falls asleep, and in the middle of the night, all these little elves show up and whip out their hammers and go to town fixing up all the shoes for him. He wakes up and bammo, everything's cool." Ralph bit the rest of the sausage off his fork and munched it, looking around. "I never pictured them wearing napkins, though." "Hey, alien boy, I see your face is back to normal," Zane said, examining James critically. "What passes for it, I suppose," James replied. "Did it hurt at all when Sabrina zapped you?" "No," James said. "It felt weird, /EA///Y weird. But it didn't hurt. It just went back to normal overnight." "She must be an artist. You looked great. Webbed feet and all." "What are you two talking about?" Ralph asked, looking back and forth between them. They told him all about the previous night, about raising the Wocket and the farmer who'd fainted when James, the little alien, had stumbled and fallen on top of him. "I was hiding in the corner of the yard near the shed, and I about gave myself a hernia trying not to laugh when you tackled him. Attack of the Martian klutzes." He dissolved into laughter, and after a moment, James joined him. "Where'd they get the spaceship?" Ralph asked, bypassing the humor. "It's just a bunch of chicken wire and papier-mâché," Zane said, downing the last of his coffee and clapping the mug onto the table. He raised his arm and snapped his fingers twice. "Sabrina and Horace made it last year as part of a float for a Christmas parade down in Hogsmeade. It used to be a giant cauldron. Now, with the help of some paint and something Jennifer called a vicemeneptio charm, it's the RMS Wocket. A very small house elf approached Zane, frowning. You, snapped young master. The elf's voice was gratingly deep, despite his size. Here you go, buddy, Zane said, handing the elf the empty coffee mug. Nice work. Keep it up. This is for you. The elf looked down at the piece of paper Zane had just handed him. He raised his eyes again. Thank you, young master. Will there be anything else? Zane flapped his hand dismissively. No thanks. Go get some sleep or something. You look tired. The elf looked at Ralph, then James, who shrugged and tried to smile. With a barely perceptible roll of the eyes, the elf tucked the $5 bill into his napkin and disappeared under the table. Zane looked thoughtful. I could get used to this. I don't think you're supposed to tip the house elves, Ralph said uncertainly. I don't see why not, Zane said airily, stretching. My dad tips everybody when he's traveling. He says it's part of the local economy, and it fosters good service. And you can't just tell a house elf to go get some sleep, James said, suddenly realizing what had just happened. Why the heck not? Because that's exactly what he'll have to go and do, James said in exasperation. He was thinking of the Potter family. House elf, a sad little pug of an elf whose moroseness was only offset by his sheer bloody-minded determination to do exactly what was asked of him. It wasn't that James didn't like Creature. It was just that you had to learn precisely how to ask things of Creature. House elves have to do what is asked of them by their masters. It's just the kind of beings they are. He's probably heading back to his cupboard or shelf or wherever it is he sleeps even now and trying to work out how he's going to sleep in the middle of the morning. James shook his head and then realized it struck him funny. He tried not to smile, which only made it worse. Zane saw it and pointed at him. Ha ha. You think it's funny too? He chortled. One can't imagine that they have to do everything we ask of them, Ralph said, his brow furrowed. We're just students. We don't own the place or anything. And we're just first years. You remembered the name of the spell Sabrina used to make the Wocket look like a rocket? James asked, turning to Zane, impressed. Vicemeneptio, Zane said, relishing the sound of it. It means something like eye fooling. If you work through the Latin, you can sort of figure it out. Horace says it just helps people see what they think they are going to see. James frowned. So when that beam of light came out of the sky onto that farmer, he sort of expected to see an alien spaceship? Sure. Everybody knows that a beam of light at night in the middle of nowhere means the little green guys are coming. You're a strange guy, Zane, Ralph said, not unappreciatively. Just then James sensed someone standing behind him. All three of them turned, looking up. It was the Slytherin girl from the previous night, the one who'd led the applause for James before his sorting. She was looking down at him with a pleasant, vaguely indulgent expression. She was flanked by two other Slytherins, a boy with handsome, rather sharp features whose smile showed an awful load of teeth, and another girl who wasn't smiling. Heat rushed to James' cheeks as he remembered he was sitting at the Slytherin table. Before he could think, he scrambled to get up, a chunk of toast still sticking out of his mouth. No, no, the pretty Slytherin girl said, raising her hand toward him, palm out, stopping him in his tracks almost as if she'd used magic Don't stand. I'm happy to see you feel comfortable enough to sit at the Slytherin table with us. These are quite different times than those of your father. But I assume too much. Mr. Deedle, would you be so kind as to introduce me to your friend? Ralph coughed, clearing his throat in embarrassment. This is my friend, James Potter. And this is Zane. I forget his last name. Sorry. He said the last to Zane, who shrugged, grinned at Ralph, then jumped to his feet and reached across the table to shake the Slytherin girl's hand. Walker. Zane Walker. It is a distinct and heartfelt pleasure to make your acquaintance, MS. The girl's smile broadened a tiny bit and she tilted her head, still looking at Ralph. Oh, Ralph said, jumping a bit. Yes. This is, Tabitha Corsica. She's a prefect in Slytherin House, a 6th year, I think. Captain of the Slytherin Quidditch team. And the debate team. And, she has a really cool broom. Having exhausted himself of everything he could think of to say about her, Ralph slumped as if exhausted. Tabitha finally accepted Zane's hand, holding it lightly, then releasing it. I'm glad to have officially made your acquaintances, Mr. Potter, or may I call you James? She said, turning to him. Her voice was like silver bells and velvet, lower than James' own, but rather beautiful. He realized she'd asked him a question, shook himself, and answered, Yeah, sure, James. And I'd be delighted if you'd call me Tabitha, she said, smiling as if this gesture of familiarity pleased her immensely. I'd just like to say, on behalf of Slytherin House, that we are glad you are among us, and we hope sincerely that any remaining, she glanced upwards with her eyes, considering prejudices be left in the past where they forever belong. She turned left and right, encompassing the 2 Slytherins with her. We all have nothing but the highest respect and, yes, regard for you and your father. Can we, I hope, expect to all be friends? The boy on Tabitha's right continued to smile down at James. The girl on her left studied a spot on the table somewhere between them, her face expressionless. Sure. Friends? Of course, James stammered. The silence of the rest of the hall seemed a huge thing. It swallowed his voice, made it tiny. Tabitha's smile warmed even further. Her green eyes twinkled. I'm pleased that you agree. And now we will leave you to finish your breakfasts. Tom? Philia? The 3 turned on the spot and swept away down the aisle. What did you just agree to? Ralph asked as they stood and followed the Slytherins at a careful distance. I think James here has either just made a gorgeous friend or a sultry enemy, Zane said, watching the swoop and drape of Tabitha's robes as she turned the corner. I can't say for sure which I am rooting for. James was thinking hard. Things certainly had changed a lot since Dad's and Mum's day. He just couldn't quite tell if they were in fact better. The 3 of them spent the rest of the morning exploring the school grounds. They visited the Quidditch pitch, which looked to Zane and James remarkably different in the bright, hazy sunlight than it had in the dark. Zane's mouth fell open when he saw a group of older students playing a scratch 3-on-3 Quidditch match. The players swooped in and out of formations, barely missing each other, calling out plays and occasional swear words. Brutal, Zane proclaimed happily as one of the players walloped a bludger at an opposing player's head, knocking him into a barrel roll around his broomstick. And I've been to a rugby match. They passed Hagrid's cottage, which looked empty and dark, with no smoke in the chimney and the door shut tight. Shortly after, they ran into Ted Lupin and Noah Metzger, who led them to the edge of the forbidden forest. A gigantic, ancient-looking willow tree dominated the edge of the clearing. Ted held out his arm, stopping Ralph as he moved toward it. "Close enough, mate," he said. "Watch this." Ted loosened the mouth of a large laundry bag he'd been dragging behind him. Out of it he produced an object, shaped roughly like a four-legged animal with wings and a beak. It was covered in multicolored scraps of paper whose colors shifted and swam in the light breeze. "No, it's a piñata," Zane exclaimed. "In the shape of a don't tell me, a sphinxoraptor." "It's a hippogriff," James said, laughing. "I like his name better," Ralph said. "Me too," Noah added. "Silence," said Ted, raising his hand. He lifted the piñata in. His other hand hefted it and then threw it as hard as he could into the curtain of branches hanging from the willow. It vanished into the dense foliage, and for a moment, nothing else happened. Then there was a rustle among the whip-like branches. They writhed as if something large was moving beneath them. Suddenly, the tree exploded into a violent flurry of motion. Its branches flailed wildly, slapping, groaning, and creaking. The noise it made was like a very localized windstorm. After a few seconds, the piñata was caught up visibly in the branches. The tree embraced it in dozens of coiling, angry whips, and then all of the branches pulled at once. It was as if the piñata had been dropped into a blender. Shreds of multicolored paper and wizard candy exploded as the ballistics charm core of the piñata triggered. Confetti and candies peppered the tree and the surrounding clearing. The tree thrashed in apparent annoyance at the sudden colorful mess in its branches, then seemed to give up. It settled into its original shape. Ted and Noah laughed uproariously. "Behold the death of the sphinxoraptor," Noah proclaimed. James had heard about the whomping willow, but was still impressed by both its violence and the other Gryffinder's casualness about it. Zane and Ralph simply stared, mouths agape. Without looking, Ralph plucked an every flavor bean out of his hair and stuck it in his mouth. He chewed meditatively for a moment and then glanced at James. "Tastes like taco." "Cool." James separated himself from the group a little later and made his way up the stairs to the landing outside the Gryffindor common room. "Password," the fat lady sang out as he approached. "Jenna Solaris," he replied, hoping it hadn't changed already. "Proceed," the painting answered, swinging open. The common room was empty, the fireplace cold. James ascended to the sleeping chamber and headed for his bed. He was already feeling a warm sense of belonging in this room, even in its dozing, midday emptiness. The beds had been neatly made. Nobby, James' huge brown barn owl, was sleeping in his cage with his head tucked under his wing. James flopped onto the bed, took a sheaf of parchment and a quill, and began to write, being careful not to spill ink onto the blankets. "Dear Mum and Dad, arrived last night with no problems. Met some cool new friends so far. Ralph turned out to be a Slytherin, which I'd have never guessed. Zane is a Ravenclaw, and he's about as crazy as Uncle George. They're both Muggle-born, so I'm learning a lot even though classes haven't started yet. With their help, Muggle studies should be a breeze. Ted showed us the Whomping Willow, but we didn't get too close. Mum, some new teachers here. Saw Neville yesterday but didn't have a chance to give him your greeting. Oh, and a delegation of American wizards and such is arriving later today. Should be interesting since Zane is from the States. Himself. Long story. More later. Your son. James. P.S. I'm a Gryffindor. James smiled proudly as he folded and sealed the letter. He debated about the best way to announce his house to Mum and Dad and everybody else, since they'd all be waiting to hear about it from his parents, and had decided that just saying it straight up would be best. Anything else would have seemed either too casual or unnecessarily grand. Hey, Nobby, James whispered. The bird raised its head, halfway, revealing one great orange eye. Got a message for you to deliver. How about a nice fly home, Nobby stretched, ruffled his feathers so that he seemed to double in size for a moment, and then stuck out his leg. James opened Nobby's cage and attached the letter. The owl sidled carefully to the window, unfolded his wings, hunched, and then launched himself easily into the bright daylight. Beyond the window, James, feeling almost absurdly happy, watched until Nobby was a speck between the distant blue mountain peaks. Whistling, he turned and ran noisily down the stairs. He had lunch at the Gryffindor table in the Great Hall and then met up afterwards with Zane and Ralph as the rest of the school began to assemble in the main courtyard. A small student orchestra had assembled to play the American national anthem upon the arrival of the United States delegation. The cacophony as they tuned their instruments was deafening. Zane commented with conviction that it was the first time he'd ever heard the Star-Spangled Banner played on bagpipes and accordion. Students milled and congregated, filling the courtyard. Finally, Professor Longbottom and another professor who James didn't know yet began to move among the crowd, pressing the students into orderly arrangements along the walls. James, Zane, and Ralph found themselves near the great front gates, watching for the arrival of the Americans with growing anticipation. James remembered the stories his parents had told of the arrival of the Beauxbatons and Durmstrang delegations back when the Tri-Wizard tournament had been held at Hogwarts. The gigantic horses and flying carriage of the one and the mysterious submarine galleon of the other. He couldn't help wondering how the Americans might choose to arrive. The gathered throng watched and waited, voices hushed. The student orchestra stood on a small tiered grandstand, instruments held at the ready, blinking in the hazy afternoon sunlight. Headmistress McGonagall and the rest of the teaching staff stood watching the sky arranged along the portico which led into the main hall. Finally, someone pointed and voices called out. All eyes turned, straining. James squinted into the golden haze over the distant mountain peaks. A dot resolved, growing larger as it approached. As he watched, two more became visible, closely following the first. Sounds drifted into the courtyard, apparently coming from the approaching objects. James glanced at Zane, who shrugged, obviously mystified. The sound was a low, droning roar, growing quickly louder. The objects must have been moving at a great speed because they were already swooping down, taking on shape as they approached the courtyard. The sound of them became lower, vibrating, a beating thrum as of giant insect wings. James watched as the objects slowed appreciably, lowering to meet their shadows on the courtyard lawn. Cool, Zane called out over the sound of them. They're carves. James had heard about his grandfather Weasley's enchanted Ford Anglia, flown once by his dad and Uncle Ron to Hogwarts, where it took refuge in the Forbidden Forest and was never seen again. These weren't like that at all. One difference was that, unlike the photos James had seen of the Anglia, these cars were shiny and immaculate with chrome accents throwing darts of sunlight all around the courtyard. The other difference, which produced a sustained sigh of appreciation from the gathered Hogwartians, was the wings, which folded out of the rear half of each vehicle. They were exactly like giant insect wings, thrumming loudly, catching the sunlight in blurring rainbow-colored fans. "That's a Dodge Hornet," Zane called, pointing at the first one as it landed. Its front wheels touched down first and rolled slightly forward as the rest of the car settled behind them. It had 2 doors and was a fierce yellow color with long wasp-like wings. The second, according to Zane, who seemed to be an expert on the subject, was a Stutz dragonfly. It was bottle green, low and long, with swooping fenders and chrome pipes curling from its tapered hood. Its wings were also long and tapered, making a deep beating drone James could feel in his chest. Finally, the last one landed, and James didn't need Zane to identify it. Even he knew what a Volkswagen Beetle was. Its bulbous body rocked back and forth as the flaming red car descended, its stubby wings thrumming underneath 2 hard outer wings, which were unfolded from the back of the car just like a real beetle. It settled onto its wheels as if they were landing gear, and the wings stopped thrumming, folded delicately, and disappeared beneath the hard outer wings which closed over them. The Hogwartians erupted into a great exhilarated cheer at the same moment that the orchestra began to play the anthem. Behind James, a girl's voice scoffed over the noise. "Americans and their machines." Zane turned to her. "That last one's German. I'd have thought you'd known that." He grinned at her, then turned away, enjoying the applause. As the Hogwarts band plodded its way through the anthem, the doors of the cars opened and the American delegation began to emerge. 3 identically dressed adult wizards appeared first, one from each car. They wore dark thigh-length gray-green cloaks, black vests over high white collars, and loose gray pants that gathered just above their white socks, and shiny black shoes. They stood for half a minute, blinking and frowning about them as if surveying the crowd. Apparently satisfied with the security level of the courtyard, the men stepped away from the open doors of each vehicle and assumed guard positions nearby. James could see a bit into the open door of the nearest car, the Beetle, and wasn't surprised at the disproportionately large and sumptuous interior. Figures moved inside, and then the view was blocked as they began to climb out of the car. The number of figures that emerged from the cars surprised even James, who'd camped inside wizard tents on many occasions and knew how flexible wizard spaces could be. Porters in burgundy cloaks moved to the boots of each vehicle, producing small flat carts and unloading innumerable trunks and cases onto them, forming dizzying, swaying piles. Young wizards and witches in surprisingly casual robes, some even wearing jeans and sunglasses, began to fill the center of the courtyard. Official-looking adult witches and wizards followed, their light gray cloaks and charcoal tunics identifying them as the members of the American Department of Magical Administration. They gravitated, smiling, hands outstretched, toward the portico, where Headmistress McGonagall and the staff were descending to meet them. The last to emerge from the cars were also adults, although their variety of dress and ages implied they were neither department officials nor students. James guessed these were the teachers of Alma Aleron, the American Wizarding School. There appeared to be one per car. The one nearest climbing from the Beetle was as stout as a barrel, with long gray hair parted to frame a pleasant, blocky face. He wore tiny, square glasses and smiled with an air of vaguely arrogant benevolence at the Hogwartians. Something about him rang. A faint bell in James' memory, but he couldn't quite place it. James turned, looking for the second professor, and found him emerging from the Stutz dragonfly. He was very tall, white-haired, with a long gray face, unsmiling and severe. He surveyed the crowd, his bushy black eyebrows working on the slab of his forehead like a pair of caterpillars. A porter appeared next to him and held out a black leather case. Without looking, the professor grasped the handles of the case in a great knobby-knuckled hand and moved forward, approaching the portico like a ship under full sail. "I'm making it my New Year's resolution to avoid any classes with that guy," Zane said gravely. Ralph and James nodded. James found the third professor from Alma Aleron just as she was climbing slowly, imperiously out of the Dodge Hornet. She raised herself to her full height and turned her head slowly, as if examining each face in the crowd. James gasped and, without thinking, ducked down behind Ralph's bulky form as her gaze moved over the crowd. Carefully, he peeked over Ralph's shoulder. "What are you doing?" Ralph asked, straining to see James out of the corner of his eye. James squinted through the crowd over Ralph's shoulder. The woman wasn't looking at him at all. She didn't appear to be looking at anything precisely, despite the scrutinizing expression on her face. "That tall lady over there. The one with the scarf tied down over her head. I saw her the other night on the lake." Zane stood on tiptoe. "The one over there that looks like a gypsy mummy?" "Yeah," James said, suddenly feeling foolish. The scarfed lady looked a lot older than he remembered. Her eyes were a dull gray, her dark face bony and lined. A porter handed her a large wooden cane, and she accepted it with a nod. She began to make her way across the crowded courtyard slowly, tapping the cane ahead of her as if feeling her way. "Looks to me like she's blind as the proverbial bat," Zane said doubtfully. "Maybe it was an alligator you saw in the lake instead of her. It'd be an easy mistake." "You guys know who that other teacher is?" Ralph suddenly interjected in a low, odd voice, indicating the stout man in the square spectacles. That's... He's the 5. No. Wait, the 50. He babbled. Zane looked at the portico, frowning. The little dude with the John Lennon glasses and the weird little ruffled collar. "Yes," Ralph rasped excitedly, beckoning to Zane as if trying to pull the man's name out of his head. "That's his name. He's money." "How surprisingly hip of you to say so, Ralph," Zane said, slapping Ralph on the back. Just then, Professor McGonagall touched her wand to her throat and spoke, magnifying her voice so that it echoed throughout the courtyard. "Students, faculty, and staff of Hogwarts, please join me in welcoming the representatives of Alma Aleron and the United States Department of Magical Administration." Another burst of perfunctory applause filled the courtyard. Someone in the student orchestra, mistaking the announcement as a cue, began to play the American anthem again. 3 or 4 other musicians joined in, hurriedly trying to catch up before they were silenced by Professor Flitwick's frantic waving. "Esteemed guests of Hogwarts," the headmistress continued, nodding at the crowd of newcomers, "thank you for joining us. We all look greatly forward to a year of mutual learning and cultural exchange with such long-standing and steadfast allies as our friends from the United States. And now, representatives from Alma Aleron, if you would be so kind as to step forward so that we may introduce you to your new pupils." James assumed that the tall professor with the steely features would be the leader, but this was not so. The stout Wizard with the square glasses approached the portico and bowed gallantly to the headmistress. He turned and addressed the crowd without using his wand, his clear tenor, voice carrying expertly as if speaking in public was something he was quite used to. Students of Hogwarts, faculty and friends, thank you for such a warm welcome. We've come to expect no less, though I assure you that we require nothing so grand. He smiled and winked to the crowd. We are thrilled to be a part of your schooling this year, and let me assure you that the learning will certainly go both ways. I could, at this point, stand up here in the sun and regale you with endlessly impressive anecdotes of all the assorted similarities and differences between the European and American magical worlds, and I promise that such a diatribe would be, of course, endlessly engaging. Again the smile and the feeling of a mutual inside joke. But as I can see that my own delegation of students are eager to rid themselves as quickly as possible of our administration for the afternoon, I can only assume that the same is true of our new Hogwarts friends. Thus, I shall merely provide the necessary introductions so that you may know who will be teaching what, and then release you all to your assorted devices. I like this guy already, James heard Ted say from somewhere behind him. In no particular order, the stout wizard called out. Let me introduce Mr. Theodore Herschel Jackson, Professor of Technomancy and Applied Magic. He is also a 3-star general in the Salem Durgus Free Militia, so I'd advise you all to call him Sir as many times as possible whenever you address him. Professor Jackson's face was as impassive as granite, as if he had long since grown impervious to his associates' joking. He bowed slowly and gracefully, his chin raised and his dark eyes hovering somewhere over the crowd. Next to him, the stout professor continued, gesturing expansively with one arm, Professor of Divination, Advanced Enchantments and Remote Parapsychology, Desdemona Delacroix. She also makes a rather intimidatingly deduced gumbo, although you'll consider yourselves very fortunate indeed if you are allowed to taste it. The dark woman with the scarf over her hair smiled at the speaker, and the smile transformed her face from that of a skeletal hag to something resembling a desiccated but pleasantly mischievous grandmother. She turned, and her blind eyes roved unfocused over the crowd, crinkling as she smiled. James wondered how he could have thought that blind, milky gaze had been the same one he'd seen piercing him through the darkness across the lake the evening before. Besides, she'd just arrived, he reasoned. She couldn't even have been there the night before. And finally, the stout professor said, last and quite possibly least, allow me to introduce myself. Your new defense against the dark arts teacher, head of the Alma Aleron debate team, and unofficial but very willing wizard chess contender, Benjamin Amadeus Franklin, at your service. He bowed deeply, arms wide, his stringy gray hair drooping. That's who I was trying to think of, Ralph whispered harshly. He's on your money, you goon. He elbowed Zane in the ribs, nearly knocking the smaller boy off his feet. Minutes later, James, Zane, and Ralph were pounding up the stairs toward the Ravenclaw common room. Benjamin Franklin? Zane repeated disbelievingly. That can't be the original Ben Franklin. He'd be, he thought for a moment, frowning. Well, I don't know how old, but he'd be really, really old. Crazy old. Older than McGonagall even. No way. Ralph wheezed, trying to keep up. I'm telling you, I think these wizard types _ys wizard types have ways of sticking around for a long time. It's not all that surprising when you Think about it. Ben Franklin almost seems like a wizard when you read about him in the Muggle history books. I mean, the guy caught lightning with a key on a kite string. James was thoughtful. I remember my Aunt Hermione telling me about some old wizard they learned about in their first year. Nicholas Flamel or something. He'd made a sort of stone that made him live forever or close to it. Of course, it was the sort of thing that always seemed to be falling into the wrong hands, so eventually he destroyed it and ended up dying just like everybody else. Still, I think there probably are lots of ways for witches and wizards to prolong life for a long time, even without Flanel's stone. Maybe you should get his autograph on one of your $100 bills, Ralph mused to Zane. I don't have any hundreds. I gave my last 5 to that elf doorman downstairs. It was all I had. He wasn't a doorman. James tried again to convince Zane. Well, he got the door for us, Zane said placidly. Ralph knocked him over when he shoved it open. He wasn't trying to open it for us / Well, I'm out of money anyway. I just hope the service doesn't suffer. Zane stopped in front of the door to the Ravenclaw common room. The eagle door knocker spoke in a high, trilling voice. What is the significance of the hat in magical mastery? Ah, sheesh, these are supposed to be the easy ones, Zane complained. Are you sure it's all right for us to go in there? Ralph said, shuffling his feet. What are the rules for hanging out in common rooms other than your own? There aren't any rules about it that I know of, James said. I just don't think people do it much. This didn't seem to ease Ralph's mind. He looked up and down the corridor fretfully. The hat, Zane mumbled, staring at his shoes. Hat, hat, hat. Rabbit out of a hat. You pull things out of a hat. It's probably like a metaphor or something. You wear a hat on your head, your brains in your head under the hat. He snapped his fingers and looked up at the eagle door knocker. You can't pull anything out of a hat that you haven't already put in your head. Crude, but close enough, the door knocker replied. The door clicked and swung open. Wow, James said, following Zane into the common room. And your parents are muggles? Well, like I said, my dad makes movies and my mom has ESP about anything I try to sneak past her, so I assume I am unusually prepared for the magical world, Zane said in an offhand manner. So this is the Ravenclaw common room. Not an electric light or a Coke machine in sight. We do have a really cool statue, though, and a talking fireplace. Saw my dad in it last night. He's adapting to all of this a little too well, if you ask me. Zane toured them through the Ravenclaw rooms, apparently making up details whenever he didn't know them. Ralph and Zane tried to teach James how to play gin rummy with a deck of Muggle playing cards, but James couldn't get interested in king, queen, and jack cards that didn't actually attack one another. When they got bored, Ralph took them to the Slytherin common room, leading them through a maze of dark, torchlit cellar passages. They stopped at a large door that dominated the end of a corridor. Set in the middle of the door was a brass sculpture of a coiling snake, its wedge-shaped head protruding menacingly, open-mouthed. Oh yeah, Ralph muttered. He shook back his sleeve, revealing a new ring on his right hand. The ring was set with a large green emerald, shaped like an eye with a slit pupil. Ralph pressed it carefully into one of the snake's eye sockets. The other socket glared to life, glowing green. Who seeks entry? The snake's head said in a thin, hissing voice. Me. Ralph Deedle. Slytherin, first year. The glowing green. I flicked over James and Zane. Antheses? My friends. I can vouch for them. The glowing eye studied Zane then James for an uncomfortably long time and then finally winked out. A series of complicated ratchets, clicks, and clanks came from within the door. It swung ponderously open. The Slytherin rooms occupied a large Gothic space carved from beneath the lake. Thick stained glass windows in the vaulted ceilings looked up through the depths of the lake, making the filtered sunlight flicker greenly on the glass. Portraits of Salazar Slytherin and his progeny, even Ralph, seemed jumpy as he showed them around. Only a few other students were in the common room, draped over the furnishings with extravagant indolence. They followed Zane and James with their eyes, smiling cryptically but apparently without malice. Ralph stiffly mumbled greetings. The Slytherin sleeping quarters felt to James like someplace a very tasteful and wealthy pirate captain might sleep. The room was wide, with a sunken floor and low ceilings hung with gargoyle head lanterns. The large beds were mahogany, with great square pillars at each corner. The Slytherin house crest hung on curtains at the end of each bed. The three boys clambered onto Ralph's immaculately made bed. "These guys are pretty hardcore," Ralph admitted in a low voice, indicating the owners of the other beds. "To tell you the truth, I feel a little out of place here. I like the Ravenclaw rooms better." "I don't know," Zane said, looking around the room admiringly. "They sure have a flair for decorating. Although it'd be hard to sleep with all those stuffed animal heads on the walls." "Is that one a dragon?" "Yes," Ralph replied, his voice strained and terse. "These guys bring them from their houses. They have families that actually go out dragon hunting." James frowned. "I thought dragon hunting was illegal." "Yeah," Ralph whispered severely. "That's the thing, isn't it? These guys' families have hunting preserves where they can go shoot just about anything. That over there is the skull of a unicorn. Still has the horn on it, although they said it isn't the real horn. The real horn is too valuable for magical uses to leave hanging on the wall. And that thing back behind Tom's bed is a house elf head. They put them on the wall when they knock him off. And I swear it looks at me sometimes." Ralph shuddered and then seemed to decide he'd said too much. He pressed his mouth into a thin line and looked from James to Zane and back. "Yeah, it is pretty creepy," James admitted, deciding not to tell Ralph any of the things he'd heard about how some of the Slytherin families lived. "Still, I expect it's mostly just for show." "What's that?" Zane said suddenly, pouncing forward on the bed. "Is that a game deck?" "It is. And you've got the wireless uplink for online competition and everything." He rummaged into a duffel bag at the end of Ralph's bed, pulling out a small black box about the size and shape of the deck of cards they'd been playing with earlier. It had a tiny screen set into the front, with a mind-boggling array of buttons beneath it. "What games do you have for it? Do you have Armageddon Master 3? Well, I'm out of money anyway. I just hope the service doesn't suffer." Zane stopped in front of the door to the Ravenclaw common room. The eagle door knocker spoke in a high, trilling voice. "What is the significance of the hat in magical mastery?" "Ah, sheesh, these are supposed to be the easy ones," Zane complained. "Are you sure it's all right for us to go in there?" Ralph said, shuffling his feet. "What are the rules for hanging out in common rooms other than your own?" "There aren't any rules about it that I know of," James said. "I just don't think people do it much." This didn't seem to ease Ralph's mind. He looked up and down the corridor. Fretfully. The hat, Zane mumbled, staring at his shoes. Hat, hat, hat. Rabbit out of a hat. You pull things out of a hat. It's probably like a metaphor or something. You wear a hat on your head, your brains in your head under the hat. He snapped his fingers and looked up at the eagle door. Knocker. You can't pull anything out of a hat that you haven't already put in your head. Crude but close enough, the door knocker replied. The door clicked and swung open. Wow, James said, following Zane into the common room. And your parents are muggles? Well, like I said, my dad makes movies and my mom has ESP about anything I try to sneak past her, so I assume I am unusually prepared for the magical world, Zane said in an offhand manner. So this is the Ravenclaw common room. Not an electric light or a Coke machine in sight. We do have a really cool statue, though, and a talking fireplace. Saw my dad in it last night. He's adapting to all of this a little too. Well, if you ask me. Zane toured them through the Ravenclaw rooms, apparently making up details whenever he didn't know them. Ralph and Zane tried to teach James how to play gin rummy with a deck of Muggle playing cards, but James couldn't get interested in king, queen, and jack cards that didn't actually attack one another. When they got bored, Ralph took them to the Slytherin common room, leading them through a maze of dark, torchlit cellar passages. They stopped at a large door that dominated the end of a corridor. Set in the middle of the door was a brass sculpture of a coiling snake, its wedge-shaped head protruding menacingly, open-mouthed. Oh yeah, Ralph muttered. He shook back his sleeve, revealing a new ring on his right hand. The ring was set with a large green emerald, shaped like an eye with a slit pupil. Ralph pressed it carefully into one of the snake's eye sockets. The other socket glared to life, glowing green. Who seeks entry? The snake's head said in a thin, hissing voice. Me. Ralph Deedle. Slytherin, first year. The glowing green. I flicked over James and Zane. Anthesis? My friends. I can vouch for them. The glowing eye studied Zane, then James for an uncomfortably long time, and then finally winked out. A series of complicated ratchets, clicks, and clanks came from within the door. It swung ponderously open. The Slytherin rooms occupied a large Gothic space carved from beneath the lake. Thick stained glass windows in the vaulted ceilings looked up through the depths of the lake, making the filtered sunlight flicker greenly on the glass. Portraits of Salazar Slytherin and his progeny. Even Ralph seemed jumpy as he showed them around. Only a few other students were in the common room, draped over the furnishings with extravagant indolence. They followed Zane and James with their eyes, smiling cryptically but apparently without malice. Ralph stiffly mumbled greetings. The Slytherin sleeping quarters felt to James like someplace a very tasteful and wealthy pirate captain might sleep. The room was wide, with a sunken floor and low ceilings hung with gargoyle head lanterns. The large beds were mahogany, with great square pillars at each corner. The Slytherin house crest hung on curtains at the end of each bed. The three boys clambered onto Ralph's immaculately made bed. These guys are pretty hardcore, Ralph admitted in a low voice, indicating the owners of the other beds. To tell you the truth, I feel a little out of place here. I like the Ravenclaw rooms better. I don't know, Zane said, looking around the room admiringly. They sure have a flair for decorating. Although it'd be hard to sleep with all those stuffed animal heads on the walls. Is that one a dragon? Yes, Ralph replied, his voice strained and terse. These guys bring them from their houses. They have families that actually go out dragon hunting. James frowned. I thought dragon hunting was illegal. Yeah, Ralph whispered severely. That's the thing, isn't it? These guys' families have hunting preserves where they can go shoot just about anything. That over there is the skull of a unicorn. Still has the horn on it, although they said it isn't the real horn. The real horn is too valuable for magical uses to leave hanging on the wall. And that thing back behind Tom's bed is a house elf head. They put them on the wall when they knock him off. And I swear it looks at me. Sometimes. Ralph shuddered and then seemed to decide he'd said too much. He pressed his mouth into a thin line and looked from James to Zane and back. Yeah, it is pretty creepy, James admitted, deciding not to tell Ralph any of the things he'd heard about how some of the Slytherin families lived. Still, I expect it's mostly just for show. What's that? Zane said suddenly, pouncing forward on the bed. Is that a game deck? It is. And you've got the wireless uplink for online competition and everything. He rummaged into a duffel bag at the end of Ralph's bed, pulling out a small black box about the size and shape of the deck of cards they'd been playing with earlier. It had a tiny screen set into the front, with a mind-boggling array of buttons beneath it. What games do you have for it? Do you have Armageddon Master 3? No. Ralph rasped, grabbing the tiny machine away from Zane. And don't let anybody else see this thing. They flip out about stuff like this. Zane was incredulous. What? Why? How should I know? What's the deal with wizards and electronic stuff? Ralph addressed the question to James, who frowned and shrugged. I don't know. Mostly we just don't need it. Electronic stuff, like computers and phones, are just muggle things. We do what we need to do with magic, I guess. Ralph was shaking his head. That's not how these guys act about it. They talked about it like I'd brought something nasty to school with me. Told me if I meant to be a real Slytherin, I needed to abandon all my false magic and machines. False magic? Zane asked, glancing at James. Yeah, he sighed. That's what some wizarding families think of Muggle electronics and machines. They say those things are just cheap knockoffs of what real wizards do. They think any wizards who use Muggle machines are traitors to their magical heritage or something. Yeah, that's pretty much what they told me, Ralph nodded. They were like passionate about it. I hid my stuff right away. I figure I'll give it all to Dad at the next break. Zane made a low whistle. I'll bet you're orthodox wizard types didn't like seeing my guys landing today in those hunks of rolling iron. You can't get much more machine-y than a Dodge Hornet. James considered this. Yeah, they might not like it very much, but there's a difference between electronics and clockwork. They think of cars as just a bunch of cogs and pistons. They aren't so much false magic as just unnecessarily complicated tools. It's the computers and stuff they really hate. I'll say, Ralph breathed, looking down at his game deck, and then stuffing it back into his duffel bag. He sighed. Let's get out of here. Dinner's soon and I'm starved. Are you ever full, Ralph? Zane asked as they jumped off the bed. I'm big-boned, Ralph said automatically, as if he'd said it many times before. It's a glandular problem. Shut up. Just asking, Zane said, raising his hands frankly around. Here, I like the idea of having a friend who is the size of a dumpster. At dinner, the three of them sat together at the Gryffindor table. James was a little worried about it until Ted appeared and slapped Zane on the back affectionately. "Our little Ravenclaw imp. How's life in the second best house on campus?" After that, James noticed that Zane and Ralph weren't the only students to sit down at other house tables. After dinner, they discussed the following day's schedules. Zane would be joining James for his technomancy class with Professor Jackson, and Ralph would be with James in defense against the dark arts. The boys explored the library, hovering outside the restricted section for a while until the librarian shooed them away with a stern warning. Finally, they said their goodnights and went their different ways. "See you tomorrow with Professor Stonewall." Zane, who had a unique predisposition for nicknaming teachers, called as he climbed the staircase to the Ravenclaw common room. Entering his own room, James found Ted seated on the couch, with his arms slung casually around Petra. Sabrina and Damien were at a nearby table, arguing quietly over some papers spread on the table between them. "Ready for school tomorrow, Junior?" Ted piped as James joined them. "Yeah, I think so." "You'll do fine," Ted said reassuringly. "First year is mostly wand practice and theory. Wait until you get to fourth year. And Professor Trelawney. At least we get to dilute Trelawney with that new bag of bones from the States," Petra said. James raised his eyebrows. "How do you mean?" Ted answered. "Looks like they'll be dividing the class. Last year it was Trelawney and Firenze the Centaur, but he's gone this year, moved back with the Valley Centaurs in Greyhaven. So this year it's Trelawney and the Voodoo Queen, Madame Delacroix." "I imagine they'll be best of friends," Damien announced philosophically. "Like peas in a pod. Like powdered dragon, eggshell and mandrake sap." James blinked, but before he could ask Damien what he meant, Ted shook his head, smiling wickedly. "Use your imagination, mate." A few minutes later, James detached himself from the group and climbed up to the sleeping quarters. He felt a pleasant mix of nervousness and excitement about the next day. For a moment, he simply stood in the moonlit room, soaking up the thrill of being there, being a Gryffindor and starting his studies. He had a momentary dizzying sense of the adventures and challenges he'd be facing in the coming years, and in that moment he wished he could jump ahead and take them all on at once. Noah appeared from the tiny washroom. He glanced at James before flinging himself onto his bed. "We all feel that way sometimes, he said, as if he'd read James' thoughts. "Wait until tomorrow evening and you'll be back to normal. A good dose of lectures and homework does it to the best of us." And he blew out the candle by his bed. 3. The Ghost and the Intruder. James awoke early. The room was silent but for the breathing of his fellow Gryffindors and the whistling snore of Noah several beds away. The light in the room was only a few shades above night, a sort of pearly rose color. James tried to go back to sleep, but his mind was too full of all the unknowns that he was sure to experience in the next 12 hours. After a few minutes, he swung his feet out of bed and began to dress. The halls of Hogwarts, while relatively quiet and empty, seemed busy in a completely different way this early in the morning. Dewy coolness and morning shadows filled the spaces, but there was a hint of busy commotion just out of sight behind unmarked doors, down flights of narrow steps. As James moved among the corridors and past empty classrooms that would later be filled with activity, he caught second-hand clues of the house elf activity that thrived in the morning hours, a bucket and mop still dripping propped open a bathroom door, the scent of baking bread, and the clatter of pots and pans drifted up a short flight of stairs. A row of windows stood with tapestries draped carefully out of them for airing. James meandered to the great hall but found it quiet and empty, the ceiling glowing a pale rose as the sky outside absorbed the light of the sunrise. James blinked and looked. Again. Something was moving among the semi-transparent rafters and beams. A gray shape flitted, humming a rather annoying little tune. James watched, trying to make out what it was. It seemed to be a small, fat man shape with a gleefully impish expression of concentration. Against all probability, the figure seemed to be very carefully balancing tiny objects on the edges of some of the rafters. James noticed that the balanced objects were directly above the house tables, arranged at intervals and balanced so delicately as to fall at the slightest breeze. "Fie!" the figure suddenly cried, making James jump. It had seen him. It swooped down upon him so swiftly that James almost dropped his books. "Who spies on the spy when he's planning his morning funnies?" the figure sang, annoyance and glee mingled in its voice. "Oh," James said, sighing. "I know you. Dad and Mum told me about you, Peeves. And I know you, little crumpet," Peeves announced merrily, looping around James. "Little Potter boy, James. Oh, sneaking about early, unlike your daddy. He preferred the night, he did. Seeking a spot of breakfast, is we? Oh, so sorry, all the little elfie welfies are still cooking it up in the basements. Hogwarts belongs only to Peeves this early. Care for a Peruvian ballistic bean instead?" Peeves shoved a wispy arm toward James' face. The tiny objects filling Peeves' hand looked like dried green kidney beans. "No, thanks. I'll be off then." James hooked a thumb over his shoulder and began to back away. "Suresy are we? Beans, the musical fruit." Peeves dismissed James and swooped back up to the rafters. Again. "The more I plant, the more to toot. Tutti fruits in little Potter's pumpkin juice, perhaps." He cackled merrily. James wandered until he was out of earshot of Peeves singing. After a few minutes he found himself on a long, pillared balcony overlooking the school grounds. Mist arose from the lake in a great golden cloud, burning off in the sun. James leaned against a railing, soaking up the happiness and excitement of beginning his first day. Something moved in the stillness. James glanced toward it. It had been at the edge of the forest, near Hagrid's cabin. Perhaps Hagrid was back. James studied the cabin. There was still no smoke in the chimney. The yard looked untended and overgrown. James frowned slightly. Why wasn't Hagrid back yet? He knew that the half-giant had a notorious soft spot for beasts and monsters, and he worried, along with his parents, that this would eventually be his undoing. Perhaps the alliance with the giants, tentative at the best of times, had fallen apart. Perhaps they had attacked Hagrid and Grop or imprisoned them somehow. Perhaps. The movement caught James' eye again. Just behind the stack of firewood by Hagrid's cabin, there was a flicker of color and a flash. James squinted, leaning as far over the balcony railing as he could. There it was again. A head peered over the firewood. In the distance, James could only see that it was a man about his dad's age. The face seemed to study the grounds, and then the man stood slowly and raised a camera. The flash came again as the man took a picture of the castle. James was about to go find someone to tell about this strange sight, a teacher or even a house elf when something flew suddenly past him. James jumped aside, dropping his books for certain this time. The figure was white, semi-transparent, and utterly silent. It streamed past him and swooped down to the ground below, aiming for the interloper with the camera. The ghostly form was indistinct in the brightening sunlight, but the interloper saw it coming, as if he had expected it. The man let out a little shriek of fear but didn't run, despite the fact that at least part of him seemed to want to. Jerkily, he raised the camera again and snapped off a few quick shots of the ghostly form as it streaked towards him. Finally, just as the form was about to overtake him, the man spun on his heels and sprinted clumsily into the perimeter of the woods, disappearing into the darkness within. The ghost pulled up at the edge of the woods like a dog on the end of its leash. It peered in, then prowled back and forth restlessly. After a minute it turned and began to return to the castle. As James watched, it began to take on a somewhat more solid shape. By the time the figure had returned to the ground in front of the balcony, it looked like a young man. The ghostly man walked with a determined, if rather dejected gait, head down. Then he glanced up, saw James, and stopped. There was a long moment of perfect stillness in which the man stared up at James, his transparent face expressionless. Then the figure simply evaporated, quickly and completely. James stared at the place where the figure had been. He knew he hadn't imagined it. Ghosts were as much a part of Hogwarts as wands and moving paintings. He'd seen the Ravenclaw house ghost, the Grey Lady, only the day before, gliding down a corridor and looking quaintly morose. He was looking forward to meeting nearly headless Nick, the Gryffindor house ghost. But this ghost was new to him. Of course, his parents couldn't have told him about every little detail of life at Hogwarts. A great deal of it was new to him. Still, the figure nagged at him, as did the sight of the man with the camera sneaking about and taking pictures. Could he have been from one of the wizarding tabloids? Not the Quibbler, of course. James knew the people who ran that publication, and they wouldn't be interested in the snoozing morning life of Hogwarts. Still, there were plenty of muck-raking wizarding publications always interested in the supposed dirty little secrets of Hogwarts, the Ministry, and even James' dad. Heading back toward the common room where he hoped to find Ted or one of the gremlins before breakfast, James remembered that he hadn't yet given his parents' greetings to Professor Longbottom. He determined to do so at breakfast and to use the opportunity to ask Neville about the ghost and the man with the camera. In the Great Hall, however, Neville was nowhere to be seen. The long tables were now crowded with students in their school robes. "So you saw some guy snapping pictures out on the grounds?" Ralph asked around a mouthful of French toast. "What's the big deal about that?" "I'm more interested in the ghost," Zane said determinedly. "I wonder how he was killed. Do ghosts only come back when they've been killed in some really messy way?" James shrugged. "I don't know. Ask one of the older guys. For that matter, ask Nick when you see him next." "Nearly headless Nick?" Sabrina said from further down the table. "Yeah. Where's he at? We have a question for him." "Gone," Sabrina said, shaking her head so that the quill in her hair wobbled. "He hasn't been with us since our first year. Finally made it into the headless hunt after all those years. We had a party for him and then off he went. He never came back. Must have been the thing he needed to finally move on. Good for him, too. But still." "The headless," Ralph queried tentatively, as if he wasn't sure he wanted clarification. He never came back? James repeated. But he was the Gryffindor house ghost. Who's our ghost now? Sabrina shook her head again. Don't have one at the moment. Some of us thought it'd be old Dumbledore, but no luck. But, James said, but didn't know how to continue. Every house had a ghost, right? He thought of the wispy shape that had turned into the silent young man on the front lawn. Mail call. Zane called. Everyone looked up as owls began to swoop in through the high windows. The air was suddenly full of flapping wings and dropping letters and packages. James' eyes widened as he recalled Peeve's strange project from earlier that morning. Before he could say anything, the first loud pop rang out and a girl screamed in surprise and anger. She stood up from a nearby table, her robe spattered with yellow gobbets. My eggs blew up, she exclaimed. More pops erupted throughout the hall as the owls banked among the rafters. Zane and Ralph looked around wildly, trying to see what was going on. Time to go, mates, James called, trying not to laugh. As he spoke, a Peruvian ballistic bean dropped from a rafter nearby, landing in a half-empty cup and exploding with a loud pop. Juice erupted out of the cup like a tiny volcano as James, Zane, and Ralph ran out of the milling chaos. Peeves swooped and dove through the great hall, laughing gleefully and singing about musical fruit. Technomancy class was held in one of the smaller classrooms in the levels above the main hall. It had one window immediately behind the teacher's desk, and the morning sun shone directly through it, making Professor Jackson's head a corona of golden light. He bent over the desk, scratching away with a quill and parchment as Zane and James arrived. They found seats in the uncomfortable hush of the room, taking care not to break the silence by scraping their chairs. Slowly the room filled, few students daring to speak, so that no noise could be heard except the busy scritch of the professor's quill. Finally, he consulted the clock on his desk and stood up, smoothing the front of his dark gray tunic. Welcome, students. My name, as you may know, is Theodore Jackson. I will be instructing you this year in the study of technomancy. I believe a great deal in reading, and I put a great stock in listening. You will do much of both in my class. His voice was calm and measured, more refined than James had expected. His iron gray hair was combed with military neatness. His bushy black eyebrows made a line as straight as a ruler across his forehead. It has been said, Jackson continued, beginning to pace slowly around the room, that there is no such thing as a stupid question. No doubt you yourselves have been told this. Questions, it is supposed, are the sign of an inquisitive mind. He stopped, surveying them critically. On the contrary, questions are merely the sign of a student who has not been paying attention. Zane nudged James with his elbow. James glanced at him, then at his parchment. Zane had already drawn a simple but remarkably accurate caricature of the professor. James stifled a laugh, as much at Zane's audacity as at the drawing. Jackson continued. Pay attention in class. Take notes. Read the assigned texts. If you can accomplish these things, you will find very little need for questions. Mind you, I am not forbidding questions. I am merely warning you to consider whether any question would require my repeating myself. If it does not, I will commend you. If it does, I will. He paused, allowing his gaze to roam over the room. Remind you of this conversation. Jackson had completed his circuit of the room. He turned to the chalkboard next to the window. Taking his wand out of a sheath in his sleeve, he flicked it at the board. Who, pray, might be able to tell me what the study of technomancy entails? On the chalkboard, the word spelled out in neat, slanting cursive. There was a long, uncomfortable pause. Finally, a girl raised her hand tentatively. Jackson gestured at her. Call it out. Miss forgive me, I will learn all your names in time. Gallows, is it? Sir, the girl said in a small voice, apparently thinking of Franklin's advice from the day before. Technomancy is, I believe, the study of the science of magic. You are of the Ravenclaw house, Miss Gallows? Jackson asked, eyeing her. She nodded. 5 points for Ravenclaw. Then, although I don't approve of the word believe in my class, belief and knowledge have little, if anything, in common. In this class, we will apply ourselves to knowledge, science, facts. If you want belief, Mistress Delacroix's class will be convening down the hall in the next hour. He pointed, and for the first time there was the surfacing of something like humor in the stony fagade. A few students dared to smile and laugh quietly. Jackson turned, flicking his wand at the chalkboard again. The study of the science of magic, yes. It is a common and sad misunderstanding that magic is a mystical or unnatural pursuit. Those that believe, and here I use the term believe intentionally, those that believe magic is simply mystical are also prone to believe in such things as destiny, luck, and the American Quidditch team. In short, lost causes with no shred of empirical evidence to support them. More smiles appeared in the room. Obviously, there was more to Professor Jackson than met the eye. Magic, he continued as the chalkboard began to scribble his notes, does not, I repeat, does of break any of the natural laws of science. Magic exp/o/fs those laws using very specific and creative methods. Mr. Walker. Zane jumped in his seat, looking up from the drawing he'd been working at while the others scribbled notes. Jackson was still facing the chalkboard, his back to Zane. I need a volunteer, Mr. Walker. Might I borrow your parchment? It wasn't a request. As he spoke, he flicked his wand and Zane's parchment swooped up and wove toward the front of the room. Jackson caught it deftly with a raised hand. He turned slowly, holding the parchment up, not looking at it. The class looked with marked silence at the rather good caricature of Jackson Zane had drawn. Zane began to sink slowly in his seat, as if he was trying to melt under the desk. Is it simply magic that makes a true wizard's drawing take on life? Jackson asked. As he spoke, the drawing on the parchment moved. The expression changed from a caricature of steely-eyed sternness to one of cartoonish anger. The perspective pulled back, and now there was a desk in front of the Jackson drawing. A tiny cartoon version of Zane cowered at the desk. The Jackson drawing pulled out a gigantic cartoon clipboard and began to make red slashes on the clipboard, which had the letters OWL across the top. The cartoon Zane fell on his knees, pleading silently with the Jackson caricature, which shook its head imperiously. The cartoon Zane cried, his mouth a giant boomerang of woe, comic tears springing from his head. Jackson turned his head and finally looked at the parchment in his hand as the class erupted into gales of laughter. He smiled a small but genuine smile. Unfortunately, Mr. Walker, your subtracted 5 points cancel out. Miss Gallows awarded 5 points. Ho hum. Such is life. He began to pace around the room again, placing the drawing carefully back onto Zane's desk as he passed. No. Magic is not, as it were, simply a magic word. In reality, the true wizard learns to imprint his own personality on the paper using a means other than the quill. Nothing unnatural occurs. There is simply a different medium of expression taking place. Magic exploits the natural laws, but it does not break them. In other words, magic is not unnatural, but it is supernatural. That is, it is beyond the natural, but not outside it. Another example. Mr. Earn. Jackson pointed at a boy near him who leaned suddenly back in his chair, looking rather cross-eyed at the pointing finger. Murdoch, sir, the boy said. Murdoch. You are of age for apparition, I am correct? Oh. Yes, sir, Murdoch said, seeming relieved. Describe apparition for us, will you? Murdoch looked perplexed. It's pretty basic, isn't it? I mean, it's just a matter of getting a place nice and solid in your mind, closing your eyes, and, well, making it happen. Then, bang, you're there. Bang? You say? Jackson said, his face blank. Murdoch reddened. Well, yeah, more or less. You just zap. There. Just like that. So it is instantaneous, you'd say? Yeah. I guess I'd say that. Jackson raised an eyebrow. You guess? Murdoch squirmed, glancing at those seated near him for help. Air? No. I mean yes. Definitely. Instantaneously. Like you said. Like Yuri said, Mr. Murdoch, Jackson corrected mildly. He was moving again, proceeding back toward the front of the room. He touched another student on the shoulder as he went. Miss Sabrina Hildegard, sir, Sabrina said as clearly and politely as she could. Would you be so kind as to perform a small favor for us? Miss Hildegard? We require the use of 2 10-second timers. From Professor Slughorn's potions room. Second door on the left, I believe. Thank you. Sabrina hurried out as Jackson faced the classroom again. Mr. Murdoch, have you any idea what it is precisely that happens when you disapparate? Murdoch had apparently determined that abject ignorance was his safest tack. He shook his head firmly. Jackson seemed to approve. Let us examine it this way. Who can tell me where vanished objects go? This time Petra Morgenstern raised her hand. Sir. Vanished. Objects go nowhere, which is to say they go everywhere. Jackson nodded. A textbook answer. Mississippi. But an empty one. Matter cannot be in 2 places at once, nor can it be both everywhere and nowhere. I'll save our time by not taxing this class's ignorance on the subject any longer. This is the part where you listen and I speak. Around the room, quills were dipped and made ready. Jackson began to pace again. Matter, as even you all know, is made up almost entirely of nothing. Atoms collect in space, forming a shape that from our vantage point seems solid. This candlestick, Jackson laid his hand on a brass candlestick on his desk, seems to us to be a single very solid item, but is, in fact, trillions of tiny motes hovering with just enough proximity to one another as to imply shape and weight to our clumsy perspective. When we vanish it, Jackson flicked his wand casually at the candlestick and it disappeared with a barely audible pop. We are not moving the candlestick or destroying it or causing the matter that comprised it to cease being. Are we? Jackson's piercing eyes roamed over the room, leaping from face to face as the students stopped writing, waiting for him to go on. No. Instead, we have altered the arrangement of the spaces. Between those atoms, he said meaningfully, we have expanded the distance from point to point perhaps a thousandfold, perhaps a millionfold. The multiplication of those spaces expands the candlestick to a point of nearly planetary dimensions. The result is that we can actually walk through it, through the spaces between its atoms, and never even notice. In short, the candlestick is still here. It has simply been expanded so greatly thin to such an ephemeral level as to become physically insubstantial. It is, in effect, everywhere and nowhere. Sabrina returned with the timers, placing them onto Jackson's desk. Ah, thank you, Miss Hildegard. Murdoch. Murdoch jumped again. There was a titter from the class. Sir? Fear not, my brave friend. I would like you to perform what I suspect you will find to be a very simple task. I'd like you to disapparate for us. Murdoch looked shocked. Disapparate? But nobody can disapparate on the school grounds, sir. True enough. A quaint and merely symbolic restriction, but a restriction nonetheless. Fortunately for us, I have arranged a temporary educational allowance that will allow you, Mr. Murdoch, to disapparate from over there. Jackson paced to the front corner of the room and pointed at the floor, to here. Murdoch stood and swayed slightly as he worked out what the professor was asking. You want me to disapparate from this room to this room? From over there where you are to here? This corner, if you could. I wouldn't expect it to be much of a challenge. Except I'd like you to do it carrying this. Jackson picked up one of the small hourglasses Sabrina had brought. Turn it over at precisely the moment before you disapparate. Understood? Murdoch nodded in relief. No problem, sir. I can do that. Blindfolded. I shouldn't think that'd be necessary, Jackson said, handing Murdoch the timer. He returned to the front of the room, picking up the second timer himself. On 3, Mr. Murdoch. 1, 2, 3. Both Murdoch and Jackson turned their timers over. A split second later, Murdoch vanished with a loud crack. Every eye in the room snapped towards the front corner. Jackson held the timer, watching the sand flow silently through the pinched glass. He hummed a bit. He allowed himself to lean slightly on his desk. Then, lazily, he turned and looked into the front corner of the classroom. There was a second crack as Murdoch reapparated. In one remarkably swift motion, Jackson took Murdoch's hourglass from his hand and laid both his and Murdoch's on their sides, in the middle of his desk. He stood back, looking severely at both hourglasses. The sand in Jackson's hourglass was divided almost evenly between the two bulbs. Murdoch's hourglass still had nearly all of its sand in the top. I'm afraid, Mr. Murdoch, Jackson said, not taking his eyes off the hourglasses, that your hypothesis has proven faulty. Do return to your seat and thank you. Jackson looked up at the class and gestured at the hourglasses. A difference of 4 seconds, give or take a few tenths. It appears that apparition is not, in fact, instantaneous. But, and this is the very interesting part, it is instantaneous for the operator. What can technomancy tell us about this? That is a rhetorical question. I will answer. Jackson resumed his pacing around the room as words began to scribble onto the chalkboard again. Around the room, students bent over their parchments. Apparition utilizes exactly the same methodology as vanished objects. The operator magnifies the distance between his or her own atoms, expanding themselves to such a degree that they become physically insubstantial, unseen, immeasurable, effectively everywhere. Having achieved everywhereness, the operator then automatically reduces the distance between his or her atoms, but with a new center point determined by their mental landmarking. Immediately before disapparition, the wizard standing in London envisions Ebbets Field disapparates, that is, achieves everywhereness and then reapparates with a new solidity point at Ebbets Field. It is essential that the wizard make that predestination in his mind before disapparition. Can anyone tell me, using technomancy, why? Silence. Then the girl named Gallows raised her hand again. Because the process of apparition is instantaneous for the wizard. Partial credit. Miss, Jackson said, almost kindly. Depending on distances. Apparition takes time, as we have just seen, and time is not, relatively speaking, flexible. No. The reason that the wizard must firmly fix his destination before he disapparates is that while the wizard is in the state of everywhereness, his mind is in a state of perfect hibernation. The time it takes to apparate is not instantaneous, but because the wizard's mind is effectively frozen during the process, it seems to be instantaneous to him, since a wizard cannot think or feel during the process of apparition. A wizard who fails to fix his solidity destination before disapparating will never reapparate at all. Jackson frowned and scanned the class, looking for some sign that they'd grasped the lesson. After several seconds, a hand slowly raised. It was Murdoch. His face was a pall of misery as he apparently struggled to arrange these radical concepts in his mind. Jackson's bushy black eyebrows rose. Slowly. Yes, Mr. Murdoch? Questioned Sir. I'm sorry. Where? He coughed, cleared his throat, and then licked his lips. Where is Ebbets Field? James met Zane and Ralph after lunch, all three having a short free period, with too much time to head directly to their next classes, but not enough time to go to their common rooms. They strolled aimlessly along the crowded halls near the courtyard, trying to stay out of the way of the older students and discussing their morning's classes. I'm telling you, old Stonewall has some wacky magical effect on the passage of time, Zane told Ralph passionately. I swear at one point I saw the clock actually move backwards. Well, I liked my teacher, Professor Flitwick. You've seen him around, Ralph said, amiably changing the subject. Zane was undeterred. Guy's got eyes in the back of his wig. Or something. Who'd ve thought a school of witchcraft would be so sneaky? Professor Flitwick teaches beginning spells and wand work. Doesn't he? James asked Ralph. Yeah. It was really excellent. I mean, it's one thing to read about doing magic, but seeing it happen is something else. He made his chair float, books and all. Books? Zane interjected. Yeah, you know that stack of books he keeps on his chair so he can see over the desk? Must be 100 pounds of them. He floated the chair right off the floor with them still on it, just using his wand. How'd you do at it? Zane asked. James cringed, thinking of Ralph's ridiculous wand. Not bad, actually, Ralph said mildly. There was a pause as Zane and James stopped to look at him. Really? Not bad, Ralph repeated. I mean, we weren't lifting chairs or anything. Just feathers. Flitwick said he didn't expect us to get it the first time. But still, I did as well as anybody else. Ralph looked thoughtful. Maybe even a little better. Flitwick seemed pretty happy with it. He said I was a natural. You made a feather float with that crazy snowman whisker log? Zane asked incredulously. Ralph looked annoyed. Yes. For your information, Flitwick says that the wand is just a tool. It's the wizard that makes the magic. Maybe I'm just talented. Did that occur to you, Mr. Wand Expert AI, of a sudden? Sheesh, sorry, Zane mumbled. Just don't point that crazy snowman log at me. I want to keep the same number of arms and legs. Forget it, James soothed as they started walking again. Flitwick's right. Who cares where your wand came from? You really got the feather to levitate? Ralph allowed a small grin of pride. All the way to the ceiling. It's still up there now. I got it stuck in a rafter. Nice, James nodded appreciatively. An older boy in a green tie bumped James, knocking him off the path and into the grass of the courtyard. He bumped into Ralph as well, but Ralph was as tall as the older boy and rather wider. The boy bounced off Ralph, who didn't budge. Sorry, Ralph muttered as the boy stopped and glared at him. Watch where you're going, first years, the boy said coldly, glancing from James to Ralph. And maybe you ought to be more careful who you allow yourself to be seen with. Deedle. He stepped around Ralph without waiting for a response. Now that's the Slytherin spirit you told me about on the train, Zane said. So much for I expect we'll all be friends. That was Trent, Ralph said morosely, watching the boy walk away. He's the one who told me my game deck was an insult to my wizarding blood. Didn't take him long to borrow it, though. James barely heard. He was distracted by something the boy had been wearing. What did his badge say? Oh, they've all started wearing those, Ralph said. Tabitha Corsica was handing them out in the common room this morning. Here. Ralph reached into his robes and produced a similar badge. I forgot to put mine on. James looked at the badge. White letters on a dark blue background read Progressive Wizarding Against False History. A large red X repeatedly slashed itself across the words false history and then faded out. They don't all say that, Ralph said, taking the badge back. Some of them say question the victors. Others have longer sayings on them that didn't make any sense to me. What's an Auror? Zane piped up. My dad got called for Auror duty once. He got out of it because he was on a shoot in New Zealand. He says if Aurors got paid more, we'd get better verdicts. Ralph looked bewildered at Zane. James sighed. Aurors, he said slowly and carefully, are witches and wizards who find and catch dark witches and wizards. They're sort of like wizarding police, I guess. My dad's an Auror. Head of the Auror department, you mean? A voice said as a group passed. Tabitha Corsica was at the head of the group, looking back at James as she swept on. But do pardon my interruption. The others in the group looked back at James with unreadable smiles. All of them were wearing the blue badges. Yeah, James said, loudly but rather uncertainly, he is. Your dad's chief of the wizard cops? Zane asked, glancing from the departing Slytherins to James. James grimaced and nodded. He'd had a chance to read another of the badges. It read, say no to Auror fear-mongering, say yes to freedom of magical expression. James didn't know what any of it meant, but he had a bad feeling about it. Zane suddenly turned and nudged Ralph with his elbow. Better get that badge on, mate, or your house buddies will think you've gone all soft on false history and the Auror imperialists or whatever. James blinked, finally registering something Ralph had said a minute ago. Did you say that your roommate borrowed your game deck thing? Ralph smiled humorlessly. Well, maybe not him. Somebody did. Not that many people knew about it, though. Unless They talked it up behind my back. All I know is it went missing from my bag right after I showed it to you guys. I suppose my housemates were just purging the room of counterfeit magic." He sighed. James couldn't shake the nasty feeling that was cooling in his belly. It was all wrapped up in the sugary niceness of some of the Slytherins and the odd badges. And now one of them had taken Ralph's weird muggle game device. Why? They were passing the Hogwarts trophy case when Zane, who had drifted ahead, called out, "Hey, club sign-up sheets. Let's do something extracurricular." He leaned in, examining one sheet in particular. "Read the runes. Predict your fate, and the fates of your friends. Learn the language of the stars. Blah blah. Constellations Club. Meets at 11 o'clock on Tuesdays in the West Tower." Sounds to me like an excuse to be out late. I'm there. He grabbed the quill which had been affixed to a shelf by a length of string, dipped it theatrically, and scribbled his name on the sheet. James and Ralph had caught up with him. Ralph leaned in, reading the sign-up sheets aloud. Debate teams. Wizard. Chess club, house Quidditch teams. What? Where? Zane said, still holding the quill as if he meant to stab something with it. He found the parchment for the Ravenclaw Quidditch team tryouts and began to sign his name. "I just gotta get on one of those brooms." "What do you think my chances are, James?" James took the quill from Zane, shaking his head in amusement. "Anything's possible. My dad was the seeker for the Gryffindor team his first year. Youngest seeker in team history. He's part of the reason they changed the rules. Used to be that first years couldn't be on the team. Now it's allowed, but really, really rare." James signed his name to the bottom of the sheet for the Gryffindor Quidditch team. Tryouts, he saw, were after classes the next day. "Ralph, you going to sign up for the Slytherins? Come on. All your friends are doing it." Zane leered at the bigger boy. "Nah, I was never very good at sports." "You?" Zane cried heartily, throwing an arm rather awkwardly over Ralph's shoulder. "You're a brick wall. All you have to do is park yourself in front of the goal and the defense is all shored up. All they'd need is to find a broom that'll hold you, you big lug." "Shut up," Ralph said, twisting away from Zane's arm but smiling and turning red. "Actually, I was thinking about signing up for the debate team. Tabitha thinks I'd be good on it." James blinked. "Tabitha Corsica asked you to be on the Slytherin debate team?" "Actually," Zane said, peering at the debate sign-up sheets, "debate teams aren't divided by house. They're just random. Teams A and B. Look, people from all different houses are on each team. There's even some of the visiting Alma Alerons on here. Why don't you go ahead and sign up, Ralph?" James asked. Ralph obviously wanted to. "I don't know. I might." "Oh, look, Petra's on Team A," Zane said. He began to sign his name again. James frowned. "You're joining the debate team just because Petra Morgenstern is on it? Can you think of a better reason?" "You know," James said, laughing, "Petra is going out with Ted, I think. My dad says girls don't know whether they like ice cream until they've tried every kind," Zane said wisely, sticking the quill back into its holder. Ralph furrowed his brow. "What's that mean?" "It means Zane here thinks he can give Ted a run for his money in the romance department," James said. He both admired and worried about Zane's lack of inhibition. "It means," Zane replied, "that Petra doesn't know what she wants in a man until she's had a chance to get to know as many men as possible." I'm thinking only of her best interests. Ralph studied Zane for a moment. You do know you're 11 years old, right? James stopped as Zane and Ralph began to walk on. His eye had been caught by a picture in the trophy case. He leaned in, cupping his hands around his face to block the glare of the sun. The picture was black and white, moving as all wizard pictures did. It was his dad, younger, thinner, his black hair wild and unruly over the famous characteristic scar. He was smiling uncomfortably at the camera, his eyes moving as if he were avoiding eye contact with somebody or something outside the camera's view. Next to the framed photo was a large trophy made of silver and a sort of blue crystal that glowed with a shifting, curling light. James read the plaque below the trophy. The Tri-Wizard Cup, jointly awarded to Harry Potter and Cedric Diggory, Hogwarts students of the Gryffindor and Hufflepuff houses, respectively, for winning the Tri-Wizard tournament, which was held upon these grounds, with the cooperation of representatives from the Durmstrang Institute and the Beauxbatons Academy of Magic. There was more, but James didn't read it. He knew the story. Harry Potter's name had been drawn as a competitor, fraudulently having been placed into the running by a dark wizard named Crouch. It had led to both Harry and Diggory being sent via portkey to Voldemort's lair, resulting in the evil wizard's bodily return. No wonder his dad looked so uncomfortable in the photo. He had been under the legal age for the tournament and had been the superfluous fourth contestant in a three-wizard competition. He'd been in a room full of people who suspected him of cheating and dark magic at best. James glanced at the photo on the other side of the cup, the one of Diggory. His smile looked genuine and hearty, compared to his dad's. James had never seen a photo of Diggory before, but it looked familiar nonetheless. He knew the story of Diggory, knew he had died next to his dad in the graveyard they'd been sent to, killed at the command of Voldemort. His dad rarely talked about that night, and James understood why, or at least thought he did. He sighed and then ran to catch up with Zane and Ralph. Later that day, when James stopped in his room to swap books for his defense against the dark arts class, he found Nobby waiting for him, scratching the windowsill. Impatiently, James grabbed the rolled parchment off Nobby's leg and read it. Dear James, your father and I are thrilled to hear you are settling in well, as we knew you would. Your Uncle Ron says congratulations on becoming a Gryffindor, and we all concur. Can't wait to hear how your first day's classes go. Also, I hope you hear about this from us first. Your father has been asked to go to Hogwarts for a meeting with the American wizards about international security and other matters of mutual interest. I'll be staying home with Albus and Lil, but your father looks forward to seeing you next week. Make sure you are eating more than pastries and meat pies, and be sure to get your robes and yourself washed at least once a week. That was a joke. Actually, no, it wasn't. Love and kisses. Mum. James folded the note into the book he was carrying as he ran down the steps. The knowledge that he'd be seeing his dad next week had left him with mixed feelings. Of course, he was excited to see him and to introduce him to his new friends. Still, he feared that the visit would also make the shadow of his famous father that much harder to escape. He was fleetingly thankful that Zane and Ralph were both Muggle-born and therefore relatively ignorant of the exploits of his legendary dad. As he joined the crowd of students filing into the defense against the dark arts classroom, James saw another of the badges on a Slytherin's robe. Progressive Wizards against Magical discrimination, it read. He felt a sort of aimless, sinking feeling, and then he noticed the newspaper clipping, tacked to the wall near the door. Harry Potter to join International Wizarding Summit, ran the headline. Below it, smaller type read, Head Aurordo meet United States representatives during Hogwarts ceremony. Security questions prevail. Pinned to the newspaper clipping so that it obscured the photo of a smiling adult Harry Potter was another of the blue badges. Question the victors, it flashed. Come on, Ralph urged, joining James. We'll be late. As they navigated the crowded room and found 2 seats near the front, Ralph leaned toward James. Was that your dad on that newspaper story? James had assumed Ralph hadn't noticed it. He glanced at Ralph as they sat down. Yeah. Mum just wrote me about it. He'll be here beginning of next week. Big meeting with the Americans, I guess. Ralph said nothing but looked uncomfortable. You already knew about it, didn't you? James whispered as the class quieted down. No, Ralph muttered, at least not specifically. Professor Jackson, the voice said, and while it wasn't a loud voice, it rang with an air of understated power. James turned around to see who was speaking. Madame Delacroix was standing just inside the doorway to the room, her blind gaze hovering somewhere over everyone's heads. I thought you might like to know that your class is awaiting you. You are always such a... She seemed to search the air for the right word, SF/C/C/R for punctuality. Her voice had a slow drawl that was somehow both French and Southern American. She smiled vaguely, then turned, her cane clicking the floor, and disappeared down the hall. Jackson's face was even harder than normal as he stared at the now empty doorway. He glanced pointedly at Franklin, and then dropped his gaze, reaching for his case. He froze in mid-reach, and James couldn't help glancing down toward the professor's feet. The black leather case had apparently come slightly open when he'd set it down. Its brass catches glinted. No one else seemed to have noticed except for James and Professor Jackson. Jackson resumed reaching for his case, slowly clicking it closed with one large knobby, knuckled hand. James had only a narrow glimpse into the case. It appeared to be stuffed with folds of some rich, dark cloth. Jackson straightened, picking the case back up, and as he did so, he glanced at James, his stony face grim. James tried to glance away, but it was too late. Jackson knew he'd seen, even if he didn't know what it was. Without a word, Jackson strode back up the aisle, moving with that purposeful, sweeping gait that looked so much like an old battleship under full sail, and then turned into the hall without looking back. Thank you for your patience, Franklin said to the class, adjusting his glasses. Welcome to Defense Against the Dark Arts. By now most of you know my name, and many of you, I assume, know something of my history. Just to get some of the obvious questions out of the way, yes, I am that Benjamin Franklin. No, I didn't actually invent electricity for the Muggles, but I did give them a small push in the right direction. Yes, I was a part of the American Continental Congress, although for obvious reasons I was not one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. At that time I used 2 different spellings of my name, only one of which was known to the Muggle world, which made it easier for me to know which correspondences to open first. Yes, I realize. My face graces the American $100 bill. No. Contrary to popular myth, I do not carry sheets of uncut hundreds around to snip out and sign for admirers. Yes, I am Indeed quite old, and yes, this is accomplished through means of magic, although I assure you that those means are a lot more mundane and prosaic than many have assumed. Emphatically no, I am not immortal. I am a very, very old man who has aged rather well with a little help. Does that cover most of the obvious questions? Franklin finished with a wry smile, surveying the remarkably full classroom. There was a murmur of assent. Excellent. Onward and upward then. And please, Franklin continued, opening a very large book on his desk, let us avoid any "it's all about the Benjamins" jokes. They weren't funny 200 years ago, and they are even less funny now, thank you. Crossing the grounds on their way to dinner in the great hall, James and Ralph were passing Hagrid's cabin when they noticed the ribbon of smoke coming out of the chimney. James broke into a grin, called Ralph to follow, and ran up to the front door. "James!" Hagrid bellowed, opening the door. He threw his arms around the boy, completely engulfing him. Ralph's eyes widened and he took a step backwards, looking Hagrid up and down. "So good to have a Potter back in school. How's your mum and dad and Lil Albus and Lily?" "Everybody's fine, Hagrid. Where've you been?" Hagrid stepped out, closing the door behind him. They followed him as he crossed the grounds toward the castle. "Up the mountains meetin' with the giants, that's where Grop and me we go every year, don't we? Spreadin' goodwill and tryin' to keep 'em all honest for whatever it's worth. Stayed a lil longer this year on account o' Lil Groppy. Findin' himself a girlfriend. Who's your mate here, James?" James, momentarily distracted by the thought of Hagrid's half-brother, who was a full giant performing mating rituals with a mountain giantess, had completely forgotten about Ralph. "Oh, this is my friend, Ralph Deedle. He's a first year. Like me." "Hagrid, are you telling us Grop's in love?" Hagrid grew vaguely misty. "Ah, it's sweet to see the lil fella and his lady friend together. Why, they're both just as happy as a pair of hippogriffs in a henhouse. Giant courtships are very delicate things, you know." Ralph was having some difficulty keeping up with the conversation. "Grop, your brother, is a giant?" "Well, sure," Hagrid boomed happily. "He's only a lil one. 16 feet or so. Ye should see his lady friend. She's from the Crest Dwellers tribe, 22 feet if she's an inch. Not my type of girl, o' course, but Groppy's just smitten by her. Not surprising, really, since the first step in any giant courtship is smitten the mate over the head with a big hunk of tree trunk. She laid the lil fella right out cold for the best part of a day. After that, he's been as google-eyed as a pup." James was afraid to ask and suspected he knew the answer. "Did Grop bring his girlfriend back home with him?" Hagrid looked taken aback. "Well, sure he did. This is his home now, isn't it? He'll make a good wife of her once they're done a courtin'. She's made herself a nice little hovel up in the hills behind the forest. Grop's there now, helpin' her settle in, I expect." James tried to imagine Grop helping a 22-foot giantess settle in, but his exhausted imagination shut down. He shook his head, attempting to clear it. "I hear your dad's cornin' in for a meetin' next week, James," Hagrid said as they entered the shadow of the main gates. "Havin' a meetin' of the minds with the muckety-mucks from across the pond, eh?" James puzzled over Hagrid's terminology. "If you say so." "Ah, it'll be nice to have your dad over for tea again, just like old times. Only without all the secrecy and adventure. Did I tell you about the time your dad and Ron and Hermione helped my Norbert escape?" "Only about 100 times, Hagrid," James laughed, pulling open the door of the great hall. But don't worry, it changes a little every time I hear it. Later, when dinner was almost over, James approached Hagrid where he thought they could have a more private conversation. Hagrid, can I ask you a sort of official question? 0-foot course you can. I can't guarantee I'll know the answer, but I'll do my best. James glanced around and saw Ralph sitting at the Slytherin table on the edge of Tabitha Corsica's group. She was talking seriously, her pretty face lit in the candlelight and the deepening light of the dusky ceiling. Do people ever get, I don't know, sorted wrong? Is it possible that the hat could make a mistake and put somebody in the wrong house? Hagrid sat down heavily on a nearby bench, making it groan appreciably. Well, I can't say as I've ever heard of it happening before, he said. Some people may not like where they're placed, but that doesn't mean it's not a good fit. It might mean they just aren't happy with who they really are. What is it you're worried about, James? Oh, it's not me I'm thinking of, James said hurriedly, taking his eyes off Ralph so as not to implicate him. It's just a sort of, general question. I was just wondering. Hagrid smiled crookedly and clapped James on the back, making him stumble half a step. Just like your dad, yer are. Always looking out for other people when yer ought to be watching your own step. It'll get yer in hot water if yer aren't careful, just like it did him. He chuckled, making a sound like loose rocks in a fast river. The thought seemed to bring Hagrid a great deal of hearty pleasure. Nah, the Sorting Hat knows what it's up to, I expect. Everything'll come out all right. Yeah, wait and see. But as James walked back to his table, making eye contact with Ralph for a moment as he passed the Slytherins, he wondered